Okay, good evening to everyone joining this Royal Photographic Society online event, in which I'm delighted to be in conversation with Alissa Everett, Nairobi-based photojournalist and documentary photographer. Now, it's been a bit hit and miss whether we're actually going to meet up in person or do this online with Alissa in Nairobi and me in Bristol. But I got a text this afternoon to say, I'm on the train, I'll see you in Bristol. So fantastic that you're here. Thank you very much for making the journey to Nairobi to London, London to Bristol. Which part of the journey was the more difficult?
Definitely the Nairobi to London.
Oh, right, okay, that's good. Well, at least it's not tomorrow, which we've got rail strikes tomorrow. So now, Alissa, you're a self-styled humanitarian photographer. What does that mean? What are you?
Well, I'm a documentary photographer, meaning I document a situation the way I find it. I don't adjust my frames or scenes that I'm in. And I work mostly from the humanitarian side, meaning I photograph people for the most part. Also, my clients are humanitarian organizations such as UNICEF or the UNHCR, World Food Programme.
So if we go back a bit further to find out how you became that, you did a degree at UCLA.
I did.
In political science, was it?
And international relations.
And then from there you went to the US Peace Corps. Just tell us a bit about what you did in the Peace Corps. Senegal, I think.
Senegal. In the Peace Corps, I lived in a small village where I had no running water and no electricity, no cell phones, no phones whatsoever, no internet, interestingly, I'm dating myself. But I worked with women's groups primarily, doing income generating activities. And the Peace Corps was absolutely instrumental in terms of how that's shaped my life and the way I move around the world, but also the way I make my photographs and engage with communities that I work in.
So it was almost a grounding for what would come later. But you didn't go straight into photography, did you? You went into the lucrative world of investment banking.
I had to pay for this life that I live now, right? I had to save up some money to be able to travel and photograph the way I needed to.
So 3 years as a banker?
I spent 3 years in investment banking based in San Francisco.
And then you had a life-changing moment when you decided that that wasn't for you.
I did. I was really impacted by the World Trade Center and the events there. I was actually in the World Trade Center a week before the... This is before 9/11. Before 9/11, exactly. And lost some people that I knew, some clients. And that was a big eye-opener. And I decided at that point that what I really wanted was to love my life every day. I wanted to live. I didn't want work to be work. I wanted work to be something I was passionate about. And I was lucky to have found something that I was passionate about that would take me around the world to be able to explore the issues that I wanted to explore. So you had that decision when you were a banker. After 3 years, you said, right, I'm going to be a photographer. Yeah. What was it that really sort of drew you to photography? Why is it photography that you went to and not print journalism? Well, I always loved photography. From when I was a small child, I had the yellow back volumes of National Geographic in my house, and I used to flip through photographs and look at them and imagine a world beyond. I was a political science and international relations major, so this pull to be out in the world, exploring the world was great for me. And photography was an avenue. It was something that I loved, the art of making photographs, but I also loved where photography was able to take me. Well, we're going to look at photographs now. It's not going to be just you and me on screen for the whole evening. And you've grouped your photographs into 6 sets. And these sets don't present your photographic journey chronologically, but they present to us a way of working, an approach to photography and an approach to the authenticity of your photography. So if we go now to look at the photographs, the first of these sets is called Access and Trust. And I think this is a central theme to your photography. But before we go into this, just answer one question for me. Sure. Did you get any formal training in photography?
Did you do a degree in photography or a diploma or what?
I did not. I actually took a black and white darkroom photography class in that transition between banking and going out into the world and making the photographs to immerse myself in that world and the art.
Brilliant. So you started with film.
I did.
What a great way to start.
I did.
Okay, so the first set of photographs then, talk us through these and how do these perhaps demonstrate your approach of achieving authenticity through your photography?
Well, as I mentioned, I spent 2.5 years living in an African village as a local. There were no other Westerners. I lived as a Senegalese person. I spoke French and Wolof, and that gave me, that taught me patience, but it also gave me an ability to communicate with people who were from a culture and a place that was different than my own. And I think what I learned in a way was to become a chameleon and to start really assimilating in, but also learning from the people that I was spending time with, which I think has informed my photography since. I find myself frequently able to come into a situation and introduce myself into a situation, but through being able to just sit and be with people, I can almost disappear and people will go back to what they're doing or will accept me in a way and open up, not necessarily verbally, but open up in themselves to me. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, yeah. And do you feel that you've an advantage or a disadvantage in being a woman with a camera?
Being a woman has always been an advantage for me. I spend most of my time photographing women and children, women's issues, but I think I learned in the Peace Corps that men sometimes aren't quite sure what to do with a woman who's Western, so we're not their women, but we're also not a man, so we're not threatening because we're still a woman, but we're not treated the same as a local woman would be treated. So we're invited into pretty much the gamut of experiences and places that one might go. There's been a few occasions where I've been told not to enter into a mosque, for example, or somewhere because I was a woman, but more often the doors are opened.
So in this photograph that we look at here, tell us about this one, because this is a Muslim girl. She's pregnant in a clinic, but she's unveiled.
She is.
Now, a man wouldn't have got that shot.
No, a man would not have gotten that, and a man wouldn't have been there.
Right.
So this is in Afghanistan. This is one of the key images of my exhibition covering beauty in Venice.
This is at the Biennale.
At the Biennale. And this image I made while I was working with an NGO, an organization that works on children's and girls' education in Afghanistan, but they also do maternal health programming. And when I walked into this clinic, all the women who were pregnant were covered. And
as in veiled.
Veiled, correct. And I asked, after some time talking to the women and understanding what some of their issues were, I asked if anyone would be willing to unveil themselves and let me photograph them. And this woman was, and she pulled back her veil, and quite frankly, I was absolutely blown away by her beauty and her presence. And I couldn't see when she had her burqa down how pregnant she was. So I didn't have any idea what she was going to look like.
Right.
And you know, it was a really very trusting, very courageous move for her to do that.
A beautiful image. So this one is taken entirely differently. And
yes.
I've admired through looking at photographs that they're not all taken from 5'2". Is it 5'2", 5'2", or something like that?
I'm 5'9".
5'9".
I
Yeah. Okay, maybe I'm taller than I thought. So this one is definitely not taken from 5'9".
No.
So just talk us through this photograph. How did you get this? Is in a mosque?
No, this is actually in northern Iraq with a Yazidi population, and so this is in a temple. And this was, I put this into this category of access and trust because I think one of the things that makes photography a really interesting access point is that I'm often looking for a different perspective. I'm looking for a different angle. And I could see the women going to the door of this temple.
So you were on the outside looking in?
I was. And I realized that the photograph was really from the inside looking out so that you could actually see what was going on. And the women actually spread people spread the seas of people and helped direct me in so that I could make the photograph from the perspective. Yeah. And you can see the girl in the background is looking at me and she's kind of watching what I'm doing. But the women who were worshiping were just doing what they would do.
Now, this is one of my, there are a couple of images in this set, which I think are beautiful. And this is natural light. You don't use any artificial light, do you?
I do not.
Never. No. So natural light, very, very low light levels, I presume, in here. But the equipment that you use for this, I mean, is anything special to photograph in these low light levels?
Well, I've joked that probably 90% of these images are made with a 24 to 70 lens on a 2.8 or something pretty wide open. I'm always photographing with natural light. I'm usually traveling on my own or with a translator. I'm carrying all my own equipment, and I carry very little for that reason. And I look for, all of the typical ways that one would find some light, a doorway, a window, an opening, something. But I've learned over the years to make myself very still and be able
to hunt out the light.
And to hunt out the light, yes.
Brilliant. And this, I think, is my favourite photograph from this set of 6. And this is an elderly woman, a grandmother, holding her grandchild. The woman's blind.
She is.
And lives in the dark.
She is. This was, I was on assignment for UNICEF, photographing a project on poverty and on teen pregnancy. And the girl who had given birth to this baby was about 15. She had every day needed to go off to work. She was the youngest of her siblings, and she was the one that was taking care of her mother, who was this woman, who's by now in her 70s. So you can see how young or how many children there were in between the two. So she was getting ready to go off to go fetch firewood or go to the well, do one of her chores. She would leave early in the morning and come back late in the evening, and she would take the baby to her mother. I saw her moving with the baby towards a hut, and I didn't know what was in there. And I just by instinct followed her in. Again, being a woman, I'm able to do something like that and walk into a hut rather.
So you weren't invited in, you just saw the mother and child going.
She was moving that way, and so I followed her. And she handed the baby in a pitch dark room to her mother, who was crouched on the floor. She actually wasn't even sitting down, she was squatting. And she received the baby and began singing. And it was such a beautiful moment. But I had to kind of lean up against the wall and prop myself because it was almost pitch dark inside.
So the mother of the baby then obviously knew you were there.
She did, yeah.
But just let you walk in, or?
Yeah, I followed her in, and then she actually left me in there to photograph, and told her mother that I was going to make a photograph. And
how did you leave? How did you sort of?
I just left them in the moment.
Yeah.
She was singing to her grandson, and it was such a beautiful moment that I just made my photographs and then left.
Well, it's worth doing.
Yeah.
So the next set of photographs of 6, Voices That Are Missing, Unheard. This is, again, emblematic of your approach to photography. You are using your photography to give voices to people that wouldn't ordinarily have a voice on the international stage. A wedding in Iraq during the war.
This is during the war. This is 2003 in Iraq. This is again a Yazidi population up in the north of Iraq. I was just north of Mosul, and I was embedded with 101st Airborne for some of the time that I was up there. I had gone a little further north for a couple of days into some Yazidi community, and one day somebody just came to me, and I heard this noise outside, and I went outside of this monastery where I was staying, and these people pulled up in cars. Everybody poured out. They began spraying silly string around and singing and dancing, and
Yes.
almost as quickly as they had poured out of the car, they jumped back in the car and drove off.
And that was the wedding.
That was, well, it was, they were actually moving from village to village to announce the wedding.
Okay.
And so they were taking the bride and the groom around from village to village.
So you just happened upon it, you took the photograph,
Mhm.
they moved on, and that was it.
Yeah,
No planning.
no,
planning.
nothing. And in fact, I only made about 2 frames.
This one, children going to school,
Mm,
again, another grabbed shot, or was it, did you know that they would be walking this route?
no, this is actually, they're on their way to church. And because this is in the Congo, this is in an area where there's quite a bit of violence. There's a lot of guerrilla activity. There's the Mai Mai who are quite active in that area. And thus, I think religion is very important to people. And I was going to the church to photograph. I was actually there working on a project with my nonprofit, Exposing Hope. And
We'll talk about that later.
yes, but one of the safe houses that we had built was in this community, and I was there visiting. And I, on a Sunday morning, just decided to go to the church to see what was happening. And these boys started marching down the street toward me, carrying their wooden benches, which is basically their pew. They don't have enough space. So people were pouring out the sides of the church, and these little boys were coming down with their own seats so that they could go to church.
I mean, nowadays we shoot on digital, and everybody knows about digital cameras, and they want to see the photograph at the back of the camera. How do you deal with that? Do you let them, or do you just carry on shooting? And
It depends.
Yeah,
If I've
I
got
thought it might.
time, if I've got time, because every child would want to, and then inevitably draw a huge crowd of people. So it depends on the situation. I don't remember in this situation if I showed it to them or not. I don't believe I did. And not all will ask me, but they definitely are curious. They know.
Yeah. Now this, you said that most of your shots are taken on 24-70.
Mhm.
And I'm just going to touch on equipment again.
Yeah.
This is not. This is a 17-35, and I'm grateful that you sent all your pictures via Lightroom, because I was able to look at the exit and just see what you were up to on each of the shots. But this is amazing. I mean, they look as if they're in a refugee camp,
They are. Mhm.
but they've got the sewing machines with them.
Yes.
So what happened? What's the story there?
So these are also Congolese. But these are Congolese refugees who are in Rwanda, and they're just on the other side of the border. I had gone into this camp working with UNHCR, and I encountered these women who were just sewing and talking to each other. They were these old friends. Clearly, they were, bantering back and forth, and it was such an interesting scene to me.
It's almost surreal.
It was. And then I got to talking to the women, and as it turns out, both of them said that when they fled their villages, they grabbed kids and their sewing machines because they knew they'd be able to make a living wherever they went if they had their sewing machines.
And what I like about this photograph is that the subjects are in such bright colour, and everything else is sort of natural tones, and it just makes it pop out, just leap out at the viewer. Interestingly, they don't have eye contact with you though. There are lots of photographs that you've taken. You've got that eye contact, you've got that instant sort of look. And I don't think it loses anything from this. They're obviously intimate with the work that they're doing. Three guys on a bike of various ages. Where's this taken?
This is in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. These are Syrian refugees. I think what I love about this photograph is, speaking of voices that are unheard, you've rarely seen men being affectionate with young children. I think that's rarely depicted in the news media. We see men, especially of an Arab descent, as scary or terrorists or violent, and we don't see the tender side. And I think men are very tender with their children, and I think that is something that's really important for me to show, is that there is a balance. We might see one side of people or a culture or a country, but everything is so it's so much more complex than that, the reality.
So when you're in this environment, it's potentially a dangerous environment, particularly for a woman traveling on her own. Are you just walking around looking for shots, or do you go out with an intention to photograph something specific and you go and look for that shot?
In this instance, I was actually on assignment with UNICEF, and I was photographing. There was an Australian political delegation that had come, was visiting the Syrian refugee camps on the border areas, and I was with them. They did have security, which is a very rare thing for me, and I felt so.
Sorry, you had the security?
No, well, the political delegation
okay.
did, but I was there photographing with that delegation. And I felt so kind of constricted, honestly, with the security and with the protocol, that I had actually walked away from everyone. While they were busy, I kind of took off down the side road just to get a breather and to see if I could have any sort of a more.
So you were there to photograph the delegation?
Yeah.
But you just walked off and.
Well, I did photograph the delegation as well, but then I
So
just needed a break for a minute. I just needed a break from all of them, and I walked off to the side, and that scene just happened upon me.
And this is the photograph that we used to advertise the event tonight, and it's a striking image. But this, the subject, the girl that you photographed here, had got an ambition to be seen not as a victim, and you helped her to present that image to the world.
Yeah, this was a really interesting one, and again, I think an important thing for me is to always remember that the way that we see the world is not necessarily the way people see themselves or want to be seen. And I think in this case, I was in Mozambique in the aftermath of Cyclone Idai, and I was in a shelter area. It was like a refugee camp, but it was an emergency shelter situation for those who had lost their homes. And I was photographing food handouts and solar lanterns being handed out. But this woman stopped me, and she wanted to be photographed. And it was very defiant. She was very insistent, and even that I photograph her. And she stood in this strong pose and, said, "We're not all victims."
So did she feel you were there to photograph them, the population, as victims?
Well, she could see what I was photographing, and I was in.
She made them.
Yeah, and I was in an area where that's what was happening. It was food distributions, it was other distributions, and people were lined up in these lines, and I think she just wanted to be seen. And
this girl is in, I can see from the background, UNHCR. So is this another refugee camp?
This is another refugee camp. I spend a lot of my time in refugee camps.
Yeah. But you can get out easier.
Very much
these
so.
camp.
Yeah, always fortunate that way. This is in the Congo again. And I think for me, this photograph really speaks to the dignity that people have for themselves despite their conditions, and the effort that one would put into one's appearance to feel human, to feel dignified, to feel like I'm not just a part of this scene around me. She had clearly, I'm not, quite frankly, she's sleeping on a dirt floor. I don't know how she looked so good and so clean, and her clothes were pristine. But you find that frequently, if people have a real pride, and they take that upon themselves to look that way. And I think for me, it's honoring their humanity, their dignity, to actually show them in the way that they choose to present themselves.
So similar to the shot we just saw, the sort of defiant girl in red, as the blue lieutenants, wanting to be seen not as a victim, but in their true capacity as human beings. Life agenda versus news agenda is the third set that you've selected, another 6 photographs to look at. And I'm quoting you here on this slide from an interview that you did on opera.com. I'm drawn to under the radar stories that have passion, hope and optimism. And that reminded me of something that Sebastião Salgado once said about his photography and his ambitions to show life rather than just the sensational news. And I know Salgado's been an inspiration to your photography.
Absolutely.
And how do you think your photography is similar to his?
Well, I wouldn't say that I think mine is similar. Obviously, there's obvious differences, right? He shoots in black and white, and I'm always photographing in color. But I think what really inspires me about his work, and especially his earliest work, is this drive to make a really beautiful image, no matter what the scene is in front of you. And I always want my photographs to be something that people will spend time looking at and reflect upon, rather than feeling like they need to turn away from them. I want people to engage in the subject and in what's happening, and question what they're seeing, and question what they think they know about what's happening in the world.
So this photograph was taken in Iraq 2003.
Exactly.
I think. So a lot happening in Iraq in 2003. And you photograph kids jumping off an Olympic symbol into a pool. So there's a contrast there. You're bringing a different narrative to Iraq at that time. This is a striking photograph in terms of its colour and its symmetrical composition, but the asymmetry provided by the 2 figures on the left. Where is this taken?
This is in Afghanistan. This is in Herat. I was photographing for this NGO that works in girls' education, and I had gone into town just to kind of try and understand what it was like. People were telling me it was dangerous. They said I shouldn't be out walking.
So you're on your own here?
I am, yeah. And what I loved about it was just the normalcy of it. I was actually surprised to find a scene like this. I was surprised to find shopping malls that had life bustling about. And I think one of the things that I really enjoy photographing are those moments that surprise me. I've traveled all over the world, and I'm still surprised by things.
I think at the last count, I counted about 115 countries, or is it more now?
I think it's 130 plus.
Oh, 130 plus,
Yeah.
right. You must have had a passport.
But I like those moments that provide me a moment of reflection. It's a surprise. I think, wow, this is amazing that I'm able to see this, and I'm somebody that's there and am able to make that photograph, and I'm able to share that with people at home. And I like being able to surprise people with what they think they know.
So what are you surprising us with on this picture? I mean, it looks like people either being taught to fight or taught to protect themselves, perhaps, or is it a sport? What's that?
Yeah, this is in a protection of civilian camp in South Sudan. And these are young men who would normally be fighting. They would be fighting a war. They would be unfortunately out taking revenge for killings that had happened in their villages, or atrocities against families. But instead, they had come together under a South Sudanese Muay Thai boxer. He had been a champion and had professionally fought. And he really wanted to do something with these disaffected youth.
So one man's mission, really.
It was. And he had taken these group of young men, and there were about 30 to 40 of them at the time. And they were fighting with such intensity, but it was really an outlet for them, their frustrations, their anger, it was a healthy outlet.
And what year was
sport.
This?
I think this is probably 2009,
2009. And do you ever follow up the story sort of 5 years later? Do you go back to the place and see what happened, what changes have ensued since you were there?
In some cases, definitely, yeah.
And does that follow up the story, or just for your own curiosity's sake?
I think it depends. I mean, it would be assignment based in some cases, and sometimes just my own curiosity to see how things have changed.
So do you always work on assignment, or sometimes do you just say, right, I'm just going to throw some money at this and I'm going to go to X, Y, or Z and take photographs?
Both. I don't always work on assignment, no. I definitely self-assign sometimes.
And to sort of make that commercially viable, how do you market your photographs beyond that? When you get back and you think, right, I've got 2,500 great photographs here from the Congo or wherever. How do you then get those pictures out there, and how do you make it pay so you can go on another trip? Yeah,
I mean, that's always a good question, and it's a challenge, I think, for all photographers. I have a really diversified income streams, as we would say in banking.
I think we all like a diversified income stream.
Yeah, so I have I'm represented by Getty, so I sell images through them. I have my client base that I do assignment work with. I sell prints. I exhibit in places like Venice at the Biennale. And then I have my nonprofit, which I sell images and channel funds back to projects that I care about. So through a variety of things, not every assignment pays off, so to speak, but usually it's building towards something. And perhaps sometimes in the oddest places, I make images that end up being great print sales. So I'm never quite sure. I just have to go with it sometimes.
What do you think makes a great print for a print sale? I'm looking for advice here.
Oh, you know, I never know.
No, I think it's impossible to tell.
It's impossible.
Yeah. So we've got another photograph here of a father with his child, son or daughter,
yes.
I can't remember, and a mirror by the looks of things, is it?
Yeah, so this is in the aftermath of the cyclone, and this is
in Mozambique.
In Mozambique, yeah. And this is the man's, he's sitting in what was his home. So that's the foundation of what was his home. And that is the furniture, the mattress that was his mattress in his home before. And he's sitting and he's shaving, actually. And to me, this has always spoken of that humanity. It's, you know, that despite the circumstances, people continue on with their lives. And there's something to celebrate in that.
What took you to Mozambique?
I was photographing with UNHCR.
In the aftermath of the...
In the aftermath of the cyclone, yeah. In fact, that was a great example of something I self-assigned. So the cyclone hit, I reached out to my clients and to see who would be interested in photographs. And I put myself on a plane and I got there.
Right.
And UNHCR, you know, picked me up in that time.
Picked you up?
Meaning I had decided I wanted to go, and then had been in communication with them. And as I was getting ready, you know, kind of packing my bags.
So you were going anyway?
Yeah, they said, yes, great. We'd love to get some photographs from there. So
right. And how does that work commercially? Do they fund that trip then once they've said, right, we want some pictures, or do they just say, when you get back, let's have a look at what you've got? No, they put me on a day rate. So I was able to fund myself while I was there. And when you get there, is there a fixer waiting for you, or have you got to hunt out these photographs? No fixers. No, there wasn't even a guaranteed place to sleep in this situation, because the whole of Beira had lost its power, and then the hotels were running in. There was so much flooding and damage that we weren't even quite sure what was going to happen on the other end. So I flew into the airport, and the airport had become the center point for all communications because it had a generator. And so that the airport was functioning. And once I got there, I was able to find people who had come on emergency. And then you went out into the sort of desolation of the... Yeah, I spent a couple of weeks there. So practical point here. You started on film, black and white. It was easy then. You just took a great big bag of film, and your camera didn't even need a battery unless for the light meter, but you could usually guess the exposure. Yeah. Digital, you lose power, you ain't going to take any more pictures.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of a situation like this where power is gone. How do you stay for 2, 3, 4 weeks?
I ended up commuting out to the airport a lot.
Right. So you went back to the airport.
I would go in, photograph, and then go back to the airport and have to charge and send things off. Because once the emergency systems are set up by all of the big international NGOs, mostly are the ones that come in and initially put in those emergency comms.
Right.
And
So
then
you just got to help
usually,
yourself to power.
yeah, they usually have a space for journalists because they really need the story to get out as well. It helps them do their job if the world knows what's going on.
Right. So not as easy as just taking a big bag of film.
No, but I do have a lot of spare batteries.
Yeah, don't we all? It's the way of the world now. This is a photograph in Gaza.
It is.
Yeah, I thought I recognised the wall. So this guy is obviously looking out over the strip, is he?
This is looking out into Egypt.
Ah, okay.
This is the border with Egypt. And again, it's a moment where you take the news agenda, which is mostly that the Palestinians are, I'm trying to hesitate to say terrorists, but the terrorists, and constantly, throwing rocks and making bombs and throwing them over the border into Israel. We see a lot of that story, but actually you find a lot of people that don't fit into that narrative.
So the mainstream media, perhaps suggesting, distill down the story to the big sort of ticket, big sale items. Palestinians as terrorists. We're going to just propagate that story. Here they are, pictures, evidence that they're terrorists. But you're going in and showing the complete reverse of the other side of that coin.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say they have a narrative that they're always trying to define, trying to fill. I would say that what ends up getting published is the more sensationalized. They need to sell newspapers, and headlines are sensational, and they've gotten more so, I think. Everyone's trying to capture eyeballs and capture people's attention in a very busy world. And I think my work is really about a reflection on what is happening outside of what that mainstream news cycle is.
So I suppose that brings us on to the purpose of photography, and in particular the purpose of your photography. And your next set of photographs demonstrate or help us to understand why you take photographs and what the purpose is of your photographs. Now, Susan Sontag, who we've spoken about before, we're not going to speak at length about Susan Sontag. It's perhaps for another day. That her book regarding the pain of others, my edition of that has got a photograph by Don McCullin on the cover. It's a Penguin edition, and it's the shell-shocked Marine, which is a very famous picture of his. You don't do that sort of photography, but Sontag's work and drawing on Virginia Woolf's work does perhaps give us some indication of what your photography is about. And you look at your photography, or I look at your photography and think, can this photography help avert a war? Do you think it can?
Well, I'd say my photography in particular, I guess, let me back up. I do think that photography can have a very powerful impact on public perception of what's happening in the world. And I do think that it can have the effect of creating such distaste in the public that wars can be averted or changed, and I think it's incredibly important work. My work is more about humanizing populations. It's breaking stereotypes. It's how do we think about people differently? And today, this is the beginning of World Refugee Week. And, my goal is really when you meet that Congolese person who's perhaps walking down the street, or a Syrian who owns a shop in your town, or, you hear of an Iraqi, you just pause for a moment and think differently because you've seen photographs that humanize those people. And I think that's what my interest is in how do we just become more human to one another?
I mean, earlier when we were talking, you mentioned that there was a situation that you were in. There were male photographers there, and there was you. There'd been a car bomb, I think it was in Afghanistan, and in Iraq, sorry, and a woman was running towards this group of photographers, covered in blood, carrying a child.
Yeah.
Just tell us what happened.
I knew you were going to bring that up.
Couldn't resist it. I mean, it's a poignant story, really, I think.
Well, I think in 2003, I went into Iraq to, become a photographer. And as naive as it sounds when I say that, is pretty much how naive I was at the time. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I didn't really have, I didn't have the contacts. I didn't have a lot of things, but I went in and knew that I was going to be able to make photographs in this place that somebody was going to want the photographs from. I learned over the time that I was there that I'm not a fantastic news photographer, because in a situation like that, when something happens that could make an image that might be on the cover of a magazine or a newspaper, my instant reaction is not to pick up my camera and photograph. My instant reaction was to actually help part the ways of the other photographers and let the woman come through to get help, because the ambulance was on the other side of us. And
so the photographers were blocking her path, effectively, were they?
In a sense, they were coming in from the sides and she was running towards us. And it was a very powerful moment, and perhaps that image might have done something, but it just isn't in my.
I suppose the textbook example of that is Nick Nutt's photograph of the Napalm Girl in Vietnam, where he did take the photograph.
Yes,
and it did accelerate the end of the Vietnam War. So that could have been the photograph that you took in Afghanistan. Nick, as you know, as you told me, he stopped taking pictures. He'd taken that one picture and then helped the girl. So maybe all photographers have got a bit of humanity in them somewhere.
Absolutely.
I'd like to think so.
Yes.
This is a lovely photograph. This is this in Mozambique again?
This is, yes.
And this woman's breastfeeding her child in the dereliction that I presume was once her house.
It was.
And did you just approach her? Or just crouch down in front of her and take a photograph? I
approached her. I asked her permission to photograph her, but this is how I found her. This was in a particular area that had gotten terribly flooded. It was most impacted by the cyclone, and I was walking through to see what I could find, and it was the very early days afterwards, and people didn't know what to do. They didn't know where to go, and there weren't formal shelters set up yet, and a lot of people had come back to where their homes were to see what they could salvage.
So did you get there before the humanitarian effort had really sort of got up to speed?
I got there before UNHCR got there.
Right.
There were some other humanitarian organizations that had gotten there already. But
this is on day 3, is it?
Yeah, this was day 2 or 3.
So you got there pretty quick.
I did. Luckily, I'm based in Nairobi. So
well, this is true, yeah.
Direct flight.
Yeah. And you spoke earlier about teenage pregnancies and the problems that these 2 girls here with their children. What's the story behind this one?
This is actually in Nairobi. This is in a slum called Mathare. And I was photographing, again, on assignment for UNICEF about the impacts of COVID on local population, particularly in the slums, and for kids being out of school. So teen pregnancy was on the rise. And I think these women spoke to me, one, because of just the colors. They were such incredibly
spoke to you visually
they spoke to me visually, but the story wasn't the story that you would necessarily think would have been the story. They were actually quite proud to be mothers, even though they were very, very young. And I think that that's always important to remember, that our ideas our ideas from the Western world about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate and what's good and what's bad and how people might feel about their situation, meaning a girl who's a teenager who's got a child. We might think in the Western world that that would be something shameful or something that she would be upset about. But yet in a lot of the world, it's not. And so it's important to kind of dig past your own belief systems.
These children, this is not in one of the institutions that your charity set up, is it? Or is this?
No, this is not. This is in another school.
Right. Where is this?
This is in Kakuma, in the refugee camp.
In Kenya.
In Kenya, yeah.
And you were there to photograph for the UNHCR or?
In this one, I was working with UNICEF again.
With UNICEF. And what was the narrative there? What were you doing in Kenya at that time for them?
This one was about education again, refugee education. And this is a good segue. Are we on to the Exposing Hope piece yet?
No.
Oh,
no.
Okay. Well, this would be a good segue. It will be going forward.
A good segue into, right, okay.
Into the work that I'm doing with Exposing Hope.
You're going to steal your own punchline if we're not.
I know, I better not do that. Okay.
Right. So, okay, we'll move on then. We're not quite at your charity bit yet, but the future of image making is your next set of images. Now, everybody that has a mobile phone is potentially a photographer. The photographs that everybody takes, we can't necessarily attribute to those photographs the honesty and integrity that we would like to think that a humanitarian photographer brings to their craft. Where do you think photography is going to go in terms of photographing in disaster areas and areas of conflict? Will there still be a need for photographers like you?
I hope so.
Right, okay, that's quick answer, we'll move on.
No, I do think that there's a really important role that professionals fill. I think one, the equipment and the technique and the ability to work in these types of situations. I do think there's a bit of a challenge now with media and the way it's changed, that things are getting more sensational and people are taking bigger and bigger risks with their own safety and with where they're willing to put themselves. We're seeing a lot of that in Ukraine, losing journalists, losing photographers.
And you photographed in Ukraine?
I have.
Earlier this year?
Yeah, mostly on the border areas, but a little bit in Western Ukraine as well. And I think that, you know, there's an important conversation to have about, you know, if it bleeds, it leads, and if it doesn't move, you need to get closer type of idea. And I think there's a bit of a danger with anyone being able to make photographs, but yet at the same time, it gives access to people to tell stories, and people are making now films on their iPhones, and so there's a really interesting. It's
a more competitive environment as well, because we're, as photographers, we're competing with non-photographers or photographers that just happen to be there with an iPhone. In terms of your editing, we talked about authenticity, and you spoke about the authenticity and truth of your imagery. Do you ever, I probably know the answer to this question, do you ever fabricate the shot in terms of looking at it compositionally and thinking, oh, I'm going to do this and move this, or bring a bit of light in here, or for example, the girl on this photograph, you know, would you give her that orange beaker, or would it always be you photographing reality?
I'm always photographing reality.
You'd never bring it.
I don't. No. The most I would do would be to move myself slightly, to move something out of a frame. If that were the case, say there was something, you know, bright colored thing underneath the bed, I might move myself up a little bit to.
So talking about the frame then, and you'd move yourself and you'd frame the photograph as any photographer would compose the photograph. Where would you draw the line if where your position, looking at the scene, you frame that scene, there's something in that scene that doesn't support what you're trying to say through that photograph. Would you move it, or would you move yourself, or would you just scrap the picture and move on to something else? How far would you go?
I think I would never move anything that I felt didn't fit the story of the photograph. It would be something visual, something, a bright colored object in the corner or something, but I'm never changing the content of an image to change the story of what's happening.
So it's you'd only change your framing or your position or your viewpoint just for the artistic merit of the photograph, not to change the narrative of the photograph.
Absolutely.
It would be a blurred line.
Well, and I think that goes back to your other question, which is about professional photographers and is there a role? I think when you are a professional in a field, you have a reputation and your clients know who you are and they know the photographs that you make, and you have a reputation to uphold at the same time. So I think it's an important piece of being a professional photographer and knowing that your photographs stand for something and having that integrity and that authenticity within your photographs. And I think people who are trying to kind of compete their way into the world might take liberties that someone who would have real damage to their reputation would take. Not that it never happens, I'm sure.
Yeah,
but
sure it does. Well, we know it does, but I suppose the difference between photography and propaganda, really, if you're photographing documentary photography, if you're documenting something that's happening and you can be relied upon that your images have that authenticity, then that's going to give you more work, I presume.
Yeah.
And also more respect and more trust in your imagery. This is the final photograph before we go on to the last section. And this girl, perhaps for me anyway, captures what your photography is achieving, and therefore it's a nice link into the next section. This girl was a victim of sexual violence, but she's now a counsellor. What was her journey, and how does this photograph capture that journey? There's a pride there. There's a sort of resilience that you see captured in her. But what brought you into contact with her, and how did you choose to photograph her in this way?
This is in a hospital in eastern Congo, in North Kivu province, in the city of Goma. And I was photographing with an organization called Heal Africa. And they have, they specialize, or they have a clinic that deals with women who are survivors of sexual violence, and they provide free surgery, fistula repair surgery for women. They also have an outreach program that is a network of safe houses and clinics for survivors of sexual violence throughout North Kivu province, because obviously
that's in DRC.
That's in the DRC. So obviously people are experiencing war all throughout the eastern swath of Congo, not just in cities where there happens to be a big, well-funded hospital. So the importance of having some sort of outreach, some people that are able to go into the villages and hear of attacks that have happened and find women who are suffering, and then be able to help them get to a place where they can get help. She had this is Margaret, I think, her name. She had come to that program, and through the counseling and through the program had, they find a camaraderie, they find support. There's a lot of support, counseling going on, group counseling sessions, and they use, the survivors themselves become counselors often to support younger girls who are coming in. Well, I think, as I said earlier, this takes us very nicely into the last set of images, which is a portfolio of 5 images called Exposing Hope. Now, this set of photographs isn't there to sort of promote you as a photographer,
that it is showing us what your photography is achieving and how you are using photography and your skills as a photographer to actually make a difference. So talk us through what's happening here. Back to sewing machines, obviously.
Right. So we're back to the Congo here, and we are working with survivors of sexual violence. So as I said, I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I lived in a village in Africa, and I've always had that piece of me, which felt I wanted to tell the stories, but I also felt on some level obliged to give back to the communities that I had been working in. And though I'm not able to get back to every community that I work in, usually I try and find an organization that's doing work within that community to help that population of people. So in that last image, I was in the Congo in a safe house, and one of the programs that we supported was creating these safe houses, actually physically building these safe houses. Not that I was building them, but funding it. And we funded 9 safe houses in rural areas. And again, we go back to the Peace Corps and income generating activities for women. Often the women who are victimized are abandoned by their husbands and thrown out by their communities and are ostracized. And they need a way to get back on their feet. So we would do income generating activities with them. And one of the things that we did was teach sewing classes, or did do. This is actually
another sewing machine.
Yeah, well, this is actually an image in that same safe house of that sewing project. And this is being exhibited in San Francisco at a fundraiser. So I made, this is a very large print, it's about 8 feet long on canvas. And I will sometimes exhibit the work. So I sometimes sell prints, but I'll exhibit the work, talk about the situation, and then fundraise for the programs that I'm supporting.
So you're selling the photographs and you're using the photographs to promote your activities for philanthropy that will fund directly the projects that you're working on.
Yeah, so I always have a partner organization wherever I'm working, another NGO that's on the ground, because I'm not someone that's doing the bricks and mortar. So I'll find a project and an organization that I really like, and then I'll fund a project through them.
And this is one of those projects?
Yes, this is one of those projects. I just opened this library in the Kakuma refugee camp for South Sudanese refugees. And it's, we just opened it on Friday. A week ago Friday.
Oh, really? This is that recent. Goodness.
Yeah, and it's a library. In this case, it was a decision that we made as a board to support a project that would help a lot of kids. The school that it's at has 2,500 students, secondary school, and they've gone to 2 schools in one. The population of the refugee camp has grown tremendously, and the facilities are not there. So they have one school of kids, 1,250 kids who come to school from 6:30 in the morning until 12:30, and they all leave. And a whole nother school of kids come in from 1 o'clock until about 5:30, 6 o'clock in the evening. And they wear different uniforms. But because of
different
that,
schools, but in the same physical space
exactly.
at different times.
But because of that, they don't have any space to study outside of school hours. So we built this library to create that facility and to give them access to textbooks and other books that they wouldn't be able to afford. Or
so how many of these projects have you completed now?
Well, we've worked in Darfur, in the Congo, and Kenya and Uganda. So 4 different country projects.
One project in each, or?
Yeah, and in fact, the project I worked on in Afghanistan was also an exposure project. In that case, I went over and photographed pro bono for the organization, which is run by an Afghan woman, to help her create a body of work that would represent her work to donors. And she's actually ended up winning a couple of really large global prizes.
Did the pull out of Afghanistan affect your working there?
I haven't been back since.
Really? Because of that, or?
No, not because of that.
Will you go back?
I will.
When?
Yeah.
When
In fact, I was just speaking with the woman who runs this organization. Yeah, a couple of weeks ago.
So you'll be going soon?
We'll see. I hope so.
Brilliant. And this last photograph.
This is the library.
Yeah, this is it.
The opening.
Wow.
And you just get a sense of, the enthusiasm for study and how many kids can fit in and what conditions the kids will study in.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Alissa, for this conversation. We've covered quite a lot of ground, I think. But most importantly, I think we've seen how you as an individual bring your humanity to your profession and to the craft of photography, but not only to present stories, narratives, giving people that voice that you wanted to give them, but to go back there and actually make a difference. It's amazing. It's been a great honour to speak to you, and I wish you the very best with your future photography and the work that you're doing in these places. But as you know, as I warned you, I'm going to finish with 10 quick-fire questions just to cover off anything that we might not otherwise have seen. Are you ready? So, in one sentence, then, how would you describe the role that photographers played in your life?
Photography has given me access to places that I never imagined going to.
3 words. What 3 words would describe a great photograph?
Composition, exposure, and subject.
All right. So you're coming at it from that. I was wondering whether the honesty and the integrity and the truth. But
we talked a lot about that.
We have. I think we've done that today. Right. Okay. Third one then. Without any restrictions, what would be your ideal once in a lifetime photographic project or commission?
Oh, commission.
Although no, it doesn't have to be paid for. Just what would you want to do?
Well, I'm working on a project right now that's kind of my ideal project. It's been going on for a very long time because it's not commissioned.
Is it top secret?
No, it's on the Sahara Desert.
Oh, really? The people that live in the Sahara?
The people, the places, the development, all of it.
Right, and have you started shooting it?
I've been shooting it for years.
And when do you think you'll finish, or won't you? Is it a lifetime's?
No, Libya is still providing a challenge for me.
Okay, so we'll get you back for the sequel then. What photographic book and you can't say Susan Sontag here, or Virginia Woolf, but what photographic book has had the greatest influence on your professional practice?
Oh, that's a good question. I would probably say Sebastião Salgado's Migrations.
Yeah, it's probably had an effect on most of us, actually. And tell us about a photographic opportunity you've missed.
Oh, this is a good one. I think the one that jumps out of my head is early days in Iraq when I was embedded with 101st Airborne, and it was the time that Uday and Qusay were captured, not alive. Yeah. And I was able to get up into a helicopter and photograph it aerially. And I wrote to the editor, the photo editor of the New York Times, and I said, hey, would you be interested in this photograph? And they wrote me back and they were like, yes, send the photograph. And I sent it back to that person. But they had gone on, I think it was on a Thursday evening, and then on Friday they were out of the office. And I got an email back on the Monday saying, next time be sure to CC the picture desk, because I was out. This would have been the front cover of the Sunday New York Times.
Have you ever made the front cover of the Sunday New York Times?
No.
Oh, no. Right. Okay. I wish I'd not asked that question now. It's obviously painful for you. What's the biggest risk you've ever taken as a photographer?
Probably that. I mean,
right.
I decided to go into Iraq not knowing anything. And I bought a car in Jordan and I drove across the border and wasn't quite sure what I would find on the other side.
That sounds like a risk.
Yeah, I'm still a little shocked that I did it.
You did it, you survived, and you're here. Question 7, name one item other than a camera that you would always take with you.
That I would always take with me. And besides my spare batteries, spare cards, and spare
all of that.
A bottle of water and some,
good move.
some food.
Good move. What's your worst photographic habit? Forgetting to take the water and the food, probably.
Probably shooting everything with a 24/7.
Really? All right. And tell us one thing that most people don't know about you. Surprises.
Wow, I'm sure I would have some friends that could tell you some stories that would surprise you. But I guess one thing most people don't know is that I'm a yogi.
You're a yogi.
Mm.
Does that help with your photography?
It does. It allows me to carry my camera very still, hold it very still in those dark situations.
So maybe we should all take up yoga. Last question. And this is an opportunity for you to advertise yourself now.
Okay.
What will you be doing in London tomorrow evening?
Oh, fantastic. I'm actually speaking at the Frontline Club.
Fantastic club.
Yes.
Brilliant. And
So
I'm sure you get
7:30
lots of
tomorrow.
audience.
If anyone's in London, please come.
So that's 7:30, Frontline Club tomorrow.
Yep.
In person.
In person.
Marvellous.
Yeah.
That's it. You passed the
Thank you so
questions.
much,
Thank you very much, Alissa. It's been wonderful talking to you. Genuinely, it's been marvellous.
Likewise. Thank you.
Great respect for your work and for the work that you do. Thank you very much on behalf of the Royal Photographic Society, and best of luck in the future.
Oh.
And we'd also like to thank Michael Pritchard, who's over there.
Questions.
And oh, sorry, questions. Yes, I forget, because we were going to do this with a live audience.
Yes.
And I forget that we have got an audience. And questions then.
So several complimentary comments from the audience, and Andrew Baird is asking, the person saying, it's wonderful to see your amazing work and that the Peace Corps spirit living is still strong, truly inspiring. Your subjects, and then his question is, your subjects seem so relaxed and at ease. How do you achieve that?
I attribute that to just to being able to be with people. Without really bringing a lot of myself or my ego or my own agenda to a situation. I think it all goes back to the Peace Corps, really.
Maybe it's something we should have in the UK as well.
Yeah.
We should have the UK Peace Corps. I don't know whether we've historically been very good at creating peace in places, but
Second question we have is, what's your photographic influences? You sort of touched on them, but I think our question would just like you to perhaps open out a little bit more about who's influenced your own photography beyond Salgado.
That's a good question. I'd say Steve McCurry, definitely. The portraits and the moments and the color. I've always been really attracted to color, and his use of color is amazing. I did have a question early on from a photographer that I met in a conflict area, quizzing me on who my photographic influences were. And when I didn't have a very good answer, he was like, oh, I take that very seriously.
Wasn't expecting to say him, was he?
I don't think so.
Oh, good.
I don't think he wasn't that famous at the time.
Right.
But I think also James Nachtwey has influenced me quite a bit. Not only his photography, which is incredibly powerful and moving, but he himself. And I think his moments of vulnerability and expressing how much his work has impacted him personally, I think was definitely a consideration for me in terms of how far I go into the violence and the ugliness of humankind. I have made a concerted decision at times to step back from that when I felt it was impacting me too deeply as a person.
So James Nachtwey, Steve McCurry, Sebastião Salgado. Any women?
Yeah, definitely. Lee Miller is an early female photographer. And then
she was killed in Vietnam, I think, wasn't she? With the Americans, was she? The Americans then advancing, and she stepped on the mine. Yeah.
And Ruth Greenberg, I don't know if you know Ruth. I had the opportunity to meet her in New York just about a year before she passed away. And those women were intrepid and were out there to tell the story. And yeah, they've had a great influence on me.
Good.
We've got a question from Evan asking, what would you advise a young photographer just starting out in the profession and wanting to create and share similar images of humanity?
Wow.
That's a good question too. What advice would I give? I think it's really, for me, the interaction that I have with people and the way that I'm able to approach people with, again, kind of leaving myself behind, really with curiosity, with openness, with seeking to understand them rather than bringing my own agenda. And I think that's the most important thing that I can advise anyone on when they're approaching people, is the more you can leave your own ego and set of experiences behind, the more you can just embrace them. The more open people, and the more open people become, and the more you seek to understand them, the more they want to share. And I think that's what really creates that connection.
Two final questions. I'm just going to swap them around. So I think the final one would be good to end on. So
that's the producer's role.
Yeah. Question is asking, how have ethical concerns changed over your career and the way that you approach your photography?
Ethical concerns in terms of the photography itself, I haven't really changed my style, because documenting the situation as it is, not adjusting anything within, has always been an important value to me. Ethical concerns in terms of a willingness on the other part and to be photographed, and do they feel that they're being influenced to be photographed, or they're especially in a humanitarian situation, when you're working with organizations, people can sometimes feel that they have to agree, they have to give consent to get whatever benefit there is to be gotten. So I think being more sensitive to that and really making sure that I spend the time to have that conversation before making images. I also am very, very cautious about how I photograph anyone that's been through any sort of a traumatic situation.
In what way? How do you treat it?
Often I won't photograph a face, or I 90% of the time won't use their real name, even if they say it's okay, even if they say they want to be photographed. It's I think there's just a line that I don't feel comfortable going beyond. Elements of a story that I won't share, locations I won't share. And then I did have a situation where I photographed a woman who wasn't in a traumatic situation, but she passed away, and her family contacted me and asked me to remove the image from my website. And I did. And I felt that was, they said it was very upsetting for them to have it on there and to be able to see her image. And so I removed it. Did
you offer the image to them?
I did.
Did they take you up on it? Oh,
yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Excellent. Last question.
Our final question is, what motivates you to keep producing work?
Curiosity and adventure, really. I'm always excited to go to a new place and to see a new thing and follow up on stories that I've been working on in the past. So it's just part of my DNA, that intellectual curiosity about the world and people.
Well, long may it continue.
Thank you
very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good night. And thank you from the Royal Photographic Society.